The axe was still buried in the stump. The tin lunch pail sat beside it, open, a half-eaten biscuit inside. His coat hung from a low branch, folded at the collar the way a man does when he expects to pick it back up in a few minutes. The snow around the worksite told a simple story. Boot prints moving between the stump and a stack of cut timber. Normal work, normal movement, and then a second set of tracks, leading away from the clearing into the tree line. These prints were different. The stride lengthened over a span of about 15 feet, as though the man had started walking and then, very quickly, begun to run. The tracks went 40 yards into the timber and stopped, not tapered off, not obscured by wind or melt. Stopped. As if the man who made them had simply ceased to exist between one step and the next. My name is Joel. I find old accounts of things that happened to working people in dangerous places, things that were left out of official records and never spoken of again. If you've got a story of your own, the link to submit it is in the description. And if you want more of these, subscribing is the best way to make that happen. That account was recorded in a camp foreman's log near Eau Claire, Wisconsin in the winter of 1887. The missing man's name was listed only as Gudmundsen, Norwegian. No search party was organized. In the margin beside the entry, someone had written a single word in pencil, then erased it. The impression is still legible under raking light. The word was taken. The forests of the American interior in the second half of the 19th century were being devoured. There is no gentler way to say it. From Maine to Minnesota, the white pine harvest consumed old-growth timber at a pace that had no precedent in human history. The trees that came down had been standing since before European contact, some of them 200 feet tall with trunks 5 feet across, and the men who brought them down did so with hand tools, animal muscle, and a kind of endurance that is difficult to comprehend from the distance of a century. A lumberjack in a northern camp woke before dawn. He ate in the dark, salt pork, beans, black coffee, flapjacks if the cook was competent. He walked to the cut site in temperatures that regularly dropped past 20 below. The snow was waist-deep by December. He swung an axe or pulled a crosscut saw for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours, in air so cold that sweat froze against the skin before it could evaporate. The sounds of the work were enormous, the crack of timber, the groan of a trunk beginning its lean, the deep percussive thud when a pine 2 centuries old hit frozen ground and the impact traveled up through your boot soles into your teeth. And then, at the end of the day, silence. Silence so total it had texture. The northern woods in winter after the saws stop produce a quiet that men who grew up in towns or on farms had never experienced. No birds, no insects, no running water. The snow absorbed everything. You could hear your own blood in your ears. You could hear the man next to you breathing from 30 feet away. And beyond that, nothing, or what should have been nothing. These camps were not small operations. Wisconsin alone had over 400 seasonal lumber camps running during the peak years of the harvest. Maine's pine barrens employed thousands. The workforce was transient. Men drifted from camp to camp, season to season. Scandinavians, French Canadians, Irish, Germans, men with no family nearby and sometimes no family at all. When one of them disappeared, the machine did not stop. His bunk was reassigned. His name was scratched from the pay ledger. If he had owed money at the company store, the debt was written off. If anyone asked, the foreman said he probably walked off the job or drank himself into a snowbank or got himself killed by a falling limb and the body would turn up in spring. Sometimes the bodies did turn up, sometimes they did not. The men in the camps had their own explanations. They told these stories at night, in bunkhouses that stank of wet wool and tobacco and kerosene and the close animal smell of 40 men sleeping in a space built for 20. They told them not as entertainment, though some of the stories were entertaining. They told them as warnings, as instructions for staying alive in a place where the official record had no language for what went wrong. I came to this material through a footnote, a mention in a WPA folklore collection from 1938, referencing interviews conducted with retired lumbermen in northern Wisconsin. The interviews themselves were not included in the published volume. The footnote directed the reader to a file number in a county archive that, as of 2019, had not been digitized. When I requested the file, What came back was a set of transcripts, each one between 2 and 6 pages long, of conversations with men in their 70s and 80s about the things they had seen and heard in the camps 50 years earlier. Several of the accounts described the same phenomenon. None of the men had been interviewed together. The first account comes from those transcripts and from a logging camp in Oneida County, Wisconsin, during the winter of 1894. The camp sat on a ridge above a frozen creek about 9 miles from the nearest road. It was a standard layout: a bunkhouse, a cook shanty, a stable for the draft horses, a blacksmith shed, and surrounding it on every side, timber. The cut line had been advancing northwest for 6 weeks, and by late January the work was taking men a quarter mile from camp each morning through old-growth forest that had never been thinned. A man named Peter Halverson worked the camp that winter. He was 31. He'd come south from a camp near Ashland that had shut down early after a diphtheria scare, and he had hired on at the Oneida site because it was the closest operation still running. He was experienced. He had been cutting timber since he was 17, first in Maine and then progressively westward as the big trees ran out. He was not, by any account, a nervous man. The WPA interviewer noted that Halverson spoke slowly, without embellishment, and declined to speculate on the meaning of what he described. He was 83 at the time of the interview. His hands, the interviewer noted, were still enormous. The work was routine that January. The crew worked in pairs, felling and limbing, while a skid team hauled the trimmed logs out to a landing where they were stacked for the spring drive. Halverson worked with a partner, a younger man from Quebec whose name he remembered only as Luke. They had an efficient rhythm. Halverson set the undercut, Luke worked the backcut with the crosscut saw, and together they could drop and limb a mature pine in under 20 minutes. The days were short, light came late and left early, and the quality of it was thin, filtered through canopy and cloud cover into something gray and flat that made distances hard to judge. Sound carried strangely in the cold. An axe strike 100 yards away could sound like it was right beside you. A shout from the next team could seem to come from the wrong direction entirely. The men were accustomed to this. It was simply how the woods worked in winter. Halverson told the interviewer that the first thing he noticed was the quiet. This would have been the 3rd week of January. He and Luke were working a stand of pine on the far edge of the cut line, further from camp than any other team. The timber here was old. The trunks were wide enough that you could not see around them, and the canopy was so dense that even at midday, the forest floor lay in deep shadow. Snow covered everything. Halverson said the ground was uneven beneath it, all roots and frozen creek beds, and you had to watch your footing with every step. They had dropped 2 trees that morning and were starting on a 3rd when Halverson realized he could no longer hear the other teams. This was not unusual in itself. Depending on the terrain and the wind, the sound of nearby crews could come and go. But on this morning, there was no wind. The air was perfectly still. And where normally you could at least hear the distant crack of axes or the calls of the skid team drivers, there was nothing. Just the sound of his own breathing and the small noises of Luke setting up the saw. He did not mention it to Luke. They started the cut. Partway through, Halverson became aware of something behind him. He described this carefully to the interviewer. He did not say he heard something. He did not say he saw something. He said he became aware of a presence, the way you become aware that someone has entered a room while your back is turned. A change in the air, a displacement. Something that had not been there a minute ago was there now. He turned around. There was nothing behind him but trees. He went back to work. The feeling did not go away. He said it sat at the base of his skull, a pressure, like being watched through a window. Luke, on the other side of the trunk, gave no sign of noticing anything. They finished the cut. The pine came down clean, exactly where they wanted it, and the impact shook snow from the surrounding canopy in a fine white curtain that took nearly a minute to settle. When the snow cleared, Halverson looked at the space between the remaining trees. The shadows had shifted, or rather, one shadow seemed wrong. It occupied a space behind a pine about 50 feet away, and it was too narrow and too tall for the trunk that should have cast it. He stared at it. It did not move. It did not resolve into anything recognizable. It was simply a dark vertical shape, partially obscured by a tree that had not been there before they dropped the pine. He told Luke he was going to take a look at something. Luke shrugged. Halverson walked toward the tree. When he was about 20 feet away, the shadow was no longer there. He circled the pine. The trunk was perhaps 10 inches in diameter. There was nothing behind it. There was nothing near it. The snow at the base was undisturbed. He stood there for a moment, feeling foolish, and then he noticed that the pressure at the back of his neck had intensified. It was behind him again. Whatever he had seen or thought he had seen was now between him and Luke. He turned. Luke was 50 feet away, sharpening the saw with a file, his back to Halverson. Between them stood the rows of pine they had not yet cut. Halverson said the trees looked normal. The snow looked normal. Nothing was visibly wrong. But his body was telling him something his eyes could not confirm. He walked back to Luke, and as he walked, he heard a sound. It came from his left, a soft, rhythmic sound, like footsteps pacing him, moving when he moved, stopping when he stopped. But there was no one there. The trees to his left were spaced widely enough that he could see 60 or 70 feet through them, and there was nothing moving in that space. He stopped. The sound stopped. He took a step. The sound resumed, perfectly synchronized with his boot hitting the snow. He took 3 more steps quickly, and the pacing matched. He stopped. Silence. Halverson said he did not run. He said he considered it and decided against it, because the footing was bad and because something in him understood without language that running was exactly the wrong thing to do. He walked the remaining distance to Luke at a normal pace. The sound followed him the entire way. When he reached Luke, it stopped. They worked through the rest of the morning. Halverson did not mention what had happened. The sounds of the other crews returned, filtering through the trees from the southeast, and the pressure at the back of his neck faded slowly, like a headache dissolving. By midday, he had almost convinced himself he had imagined it. That evening, in the bunkhouse, a man named Torsten asked if anyone had ever heard of the hide-behind. He said it casually, the way you bring up a rumor. A few of the older men exchanged glances. One of them, a man who had worked camps in Maine for 20 years before coming west, said he did not use that word, and he would appreciate it if Torsten did not either. Halverson asked what a hide-behind was. The man from Maine did not answer. Torsten did. He said it was something that followed men in the timber. He said it was tall, taller than a man, but thin enough to stand behind a tree trunk and not be seen. He said it was fast. It moved when you moved. It stopped when you stopped. It stayed in your blind spot, behind you, always behind you. And if you turned to look, it shifted with you, keeping the nearest tree between itself and your eyes. You could never see it straight on. You would only ever catch it at the edge of your vision, and by the time your brain registered what it had seen, it would be gone. Torsten said the thing was covered in dark fur, black or very dark brown, and that it walked upright on 2 legs but had short, heavy forelegs that ended in claws. Claws like a grizzly, he said. It could flatten itself behind cover that should not have been wide enough to hide anything larger than a fox. He said the Lumberjacks in Maine called it the hide-behind because that is what it did. It hid behind things, trees, stumps, rock outcroppings, stacked timber, whatever was nearest. And it was patient. It could follow a man for hours, days, waiting for the moment he was alone, waiting for the distance between him and the nearest other person to grow just wide enough. Halverson asked what happened when the distance was wide enough. Torsten said the man disappeared. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the man from Maine said the only thing that kept it away was liquor. He said the hide-behind could not abide the smell of alcohol on a man's breath, or more specifically, in his guts. The creature could smell it through the skin. A man who had been drinking was safe. A sober man, alone in the timber, was not. Several men laughed at this. It was, after all, a convenient piece of folklore for men whose primary entertainment was drinking. But Halverson did not laugh. He said that in the interview, 44 years later, the old man from Maine's face was what stayed with him. The way he had said, "I do not use that word." Not frightened, firm. Like a man establishing a boundary with something that might be listening. Halverson went back to the same stand of timber the next morning with Luke. He worked the entire day without incident. The sounds of the forest were normal. The shadows fell where they should have fallen. Nothing followed him. Nothing paced his steps. The pressure at the back of his neck did not return. He worked that camp for another 6 weeks until the spring thaw broke, and he never experienced anything like it again at that site. But Luke did not come back after the weekend break in early February. The foreman said he had drawn his pay and left. His bunk was cleared. His things were gone. Halverson asked if anyone had seen him leave. No one had. Halverson asked if there were tracks on the road. The foreman said there were always tracks on the road and he did not have time to catalog them. There was no newspaper report, no missing persons inquiry. Luke was a transient laborer with no local family. Men like him came and went with the seasons. His absence was noted in the pay ledger as departed February 4th, and that was the end of it. Halverson told the WPA interviewer one more thing. He said that on the morning after Luke failed to appear, he had walked out to the stand of pine where they had been working together. He said he did not know why he went. He said the cut site looked the same as they had left it. The tools were where they should have been. The last tree they had dropped was still lying where it fell, not yet limbed. But there was something in the snow near the base of that tree. A mark, not a boot print, not an animal track. A long, narrow depression, as though something heavy had been dragged. The mark ran for about 12 feet and then stopped at the trunk of a standing pine. Behind the pine, the snow was undisturbed. Halverson did not go closer. He turned around and walked back to camp. He said the walk took about 4 minutes. He said that for all 4 of those minutes, he heard something pacing him through the trees, matching his steps exactly, staying just outside the edge of his vision. He did not turn around. The hidebehind appears in American folklore collections beginning in the 1880s, though the stories are almost certainly older than the first written references. It belongs to a tradition that lumberjacks called fearsome critters, a loose bestiary of impossible animals said to inhabit the deep woods. Most of these creatures were jokes: the hoop snake that bit its own tail and rolled downhill like a wheel, the splinter cat that flew headfirst into trees, the side hill gouger with legs shorter on one side so it could walk on steep slopes. Camp humor. Bunkhouse tall tales told to green workers to see if they would believe. The hidebehind was different. It appeared in the same collections, was sometimes listed alongside the comic creatures, but the men who told the story did not tell it the same way. The delivery changed. The details were consistent across camps separated by hundreds of miles and decades of time. The thing was tall. The thing was thin. The thing stayed behind you. The thing matched your movements. You could never see it directly. And the men who disappeared were always alone. This distinction matters. Among the fearsome critters, the hidebehind is the only one that maps directly onto real events. Men did vanish from logging camps with startling regularity. The transient workforce, the remote locations, the complete absence of any investigative infrastructure in the Northwoods meant that a man could be alive on Tuesday and simply gone on Wednesday, and the only record would be a foreman's notation in a ledger. Some of them walked off. Some of them fell through ice on frozen rivers and were not found until spring, if they were found at all. Some were killed by falling timber. Some froze to death on the walk between the cut site and the bunkhouse. The woods offered a dozen ways to die that required no supernatural explanation. But the hidebehind persisted. It persisted because it answered a question the ordinary explanations could not. What happened to the men who left their tools behind, who left their coats, who left in the middle of a task between one axe stroke and the next and were never seen again? What happened to the men whose tracks ended in the middle of the forest in undisturbed snow, going nowhere? The story carried a built-in survival rule, and this is where it becomes impossible to separate the folklore from the culture that produced it. The creature could not tolerate alcohol. A man with liquor in his system was invisible to it, or repulsive, or simply not worth pursuing. The protection was specific, rooted in the body. Not a charm, not a prayer, not a ritual. A physical substance in the guts. The lumberjacks drank heavily. This was well documented and universally acknowledged. They drank rot-gut whiskey, homemade spirits, anything with a percentage. They drank after work, before work, and sometimes during work. The hidebehind gave this drinking a logic beyond recreation. It made sobriety dangerous. It made the man who did not drink the vulnerable one, the target. the one most likely to go into the trees and not come back. Whether this was the folklore justifying the drinking or the drinking inspiring the folklore is a question that cannot be answered from this distance. Both directions are probably true simultaneously. What can be said is that modern hikers, campers, and forestry workers in the upper Midwest and New England continue to report experiences that match the classic hide-behind pattern, the sensation of being followed on a trail, movement at the periphery of vision that vanishes when looked at directly, footsteps that pace yours and stop when you stop, a presence that stays behind you, always behind you, never where you can see it. These reports appear in online forums, in wilderness experience surveys, in the notes of park rangers who collect them informally and do not include them in official documentation. The hide-behind has no body. It has never been photographed, captured, or found dead. It exists entirely in the space between what the eye catches and what the mind confirms. The peripheral zone, the place where certainty fails. The forests where the lumberjacks worked are mostly gone now. The old-growth white pine that covered the upper Midwest was virtually eliminated by 1920. What grew back was different. Second growth, smaller trees, more densely packed, with none of the cathedral-like spacing of the original stands. The woods look different now. They feel different, but they are still very quiet in winter. And the shadows between the trunks still shift when you are not looking directly at them. The hide-behind accounts stop for the most part when the old camps closed. The creature belonged to a specific world, a specific kind of work, a specific quality of isolation that industrial logging in the 20th century largely eliminated. Chainsaws and skidders and logging roads that connected camps to towns changed the nature of the solitude. You were never as alone as Halverson had been, standing in old growth with a hand axe and a man from Quebec whose last name he never learned. But the forests of the upper Midwest were not the only places in North America where men went into the wilderness to work and came back changed, or did not come back at all. And the hide-behind was not the only thing the woods contained. To the north and east in the boreal forests that stretch from Ontario to Manitoba, across the shield country of the Great Lakes and into the subarctic, a different tradition existed. It was older than the lumber camps, older than European contact. It came from the Algonquian peoples who had lived in those forests for thousands of years, and unlike the hide-behind, it did not hide. It announced itself. It was known by name, and the name carried a weight that the word hide-behind never did, because the thing it described was not an animal lurking in the timber. It was a transformation, a human being turning into something that was no longer human, something defined by a single, bottomless, annihilating hunger. The Cree called it Wendigo, the Ojibwe called it Wendigo, the Innu called it Achin. In English, the word that survived was Wendigo. The earliest written account in a European language appeared in 1661 in a volume known as The Jesuit Relations. A French missionary working among the Cree in what is now eastern Canada described a phenomenon he had difficulty translating. During a winter of exceptional severity, members of the community he lived among spoke of individuals who had been overtaken by a spirit of consumption. These individuals had eaten human flesh, either out of starvation or out of something the Cree described as a sickness of the spirit that preceded and outlasted any physical hunger. Once the flesh was consumed, the transformation began. The person grew. Their skin tightened over their bones, their eyes sank, their lips eroded, sometimes described as chewed away by their own teeth, and the hunger did not diminish. It expanded. It became the only thing the person was. The missionary wrote this down. He categorized it as superstition. He moved on to other subjects. The Cree did not move on. Neither did the Ojibwe, the Innu, the Naskapi, or any of the other Algonquian nations whose territories covered the boreal forest. The Wendigo was not a campfire story. It was a diagnostic category. A person could become a Wendigo. The risk was real, it was known, and it was managed through specific practices that included exile, containment, and in extreme cases, killing. This is where the folklore crosses a line that the hide-behind never approached. There are court records. In 1907, a Cree man named Jack Fiddler was arrested by the Northwest Mounted Police in what is now Northern Ontario. He was charged with murder. The victim was a woman from his community, a member of his own family. Fiddler did not deny the killing. He explained it. He said the woman had been turning. She had shown the signs, the hunger, the wasting, the look in her eyes that was no longer her own. He had done what was required to protect the community. He had done it before. By his own account, he had killed 14 Wendigos over the course of his life. He was an Ogima, a leader, and this was part of the work. The Canadian authorities did not recognize the defense. Fiddler was convicted. He died in custody before sentencing by his own hand, according to the official report. His brother Joseph, arrested on the same charges, was convicted and later had his sentence commuted. The case generated newspaper coverage across Canada. The editorials treated it as evidence of Indigenous savagery, of superstition so deep it led to murder. None of the coverage engaged with the question Fiddler had been trying to answer. What do you do when someone in your community is no longer a person? What do you do when the hunger has already won? The court records are held in the archives of Ontario. They are dry documents, procedural. They contain Fiddler's testimony, translated from Cree into English by an interpreter whose qualifications are not recorded. Even through the double filter of translation and legal transcription, the testimony is striking. Fiddler did not describe the Wendigo as a creature that attacked from outside. He described it as something that grew from within, a seed that was always present in every person that certain conditions could cause to germinate. Starvation was the most common trigger, but not the only one. Isolation could do it. Grief could do it. The loss of connection to community, to family, to the obligations that made a person rather than an appetite. The Wendigo was what you became when the last thing tethering you to your own humanity was cut. He said you could see it in the eyes first. A flatness, a distance. The person was still there, still speaking, still performing the routines of daily life. But something behind the face had shifted. They began to look at other people differently, not with hostility, with assessment. The way a man looks at an animal he is deciding whether to kill. And then the dreams started. The person would dream of eating, would wake with the taste of meat in their mouth, would become unable to eat normal food, or would eat and never feel full. The body began to change. Weight fell away. The joints became prominent, the skin went gray, and the cold stopped bothering them. This was one of the most consistent details across every Algonquian account. The person turning Wendigo stopped feeling the cold. In a world where winter could kill in hours, where warmth was survival, a person who no longer sought warmth had already crossed a threshold. Fiddler said the killing was the last resort. Before that came isolation, ceremony, attempts to call the person back. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes a person came back from the edge and they lived the rest of their life knowing what they had almost become. These people were not shunned. They were watched, cared for, kept close to the center of the community where the tethers were strongest. But sometimes it did not work. And when it did not work, when the transformation had gone past the point of return, the person had to be killed and the body had to be destroyed completely, usually by fire. Because the hunger did not die with the body, it could persist, it could spread. The Wendigo tradition is not confined to the distant past or to indigenous communities alone. The boreal forest produced Wendigo accounts from European settlers and workers as well, though these accounts typically stripped away the cultural framework and left only the encounter. Men in the woods who saw something they could not explain, something tall, something emaciated, something that moved through the trees with a speed and silence that no animal they knew could match. The lumber camps in Ontario and Manitoba generated their own set of reports, distinct from the Wisconsin hide-behind accounts, but sharing an architecture. A man working alone at the edge of the cut, a feeling of being watched, a shape between the trees. And then, in the Wendigo cases, something the hide-behind stories never included: a smell. Described variously as rotting meat, as frozen decay, as something sweet and foul simultaneously, like fruit decomposing under ice. The smell preceded the sighting, it lingered after. Men who reported it said it stayed in their clothing for days. A journal entry from a survey crew working near Lake Nipigon in 1911 describes an evening in camp when one of the crew members, a man identified only by the initial R, refused to eat dinner. He had been quiet all day. The entry notes that R had been working alone that afternoon, blazing trail markers about a mile ahead of the main crew. When he came back, he was pale and walking quickly. He would not say what had happened. He sat by the fire and did not eat. The other men asked if he was ill. He said he was not hungry. The journal's author, a surveyor named James McLeod, wrote that R did not sleep that night. McLeod could hear him moving in his bedroll. At one point, near 2 in the morning, McLeod woke fully and saw R sitting upright, facing the tree line, perfectly still. McLeod asked if something was wrong. R said without turning that something was standing in the trees and it had been standing there since they made camp. McLeod looked. He saw nothing. He said so. R did not respond. McLeod went back to sleep. In the morning, R ate breakfast. He seemed normal, or near enough. He went back to work. McLeod noted the incident and moved on. 3 days later, the survey was interrupted by a storm that pinned the crew in their tents for 48 hours. When the storm cleared, R was gone. His gear was still in his tent. His boots were beside his bedroll. He had left the tent barefoot in a blizzard and walked into the forest. They found his tracks leading north. The tracks went straight, no meandering, no hesitation, as though he were walking toward something specific. The crew followed them for a mile before the snow became too deep and the light began to fail. They turned back. R was never found. McLeod filed a report with the survey company. The report listed the cause of disappearance as exposure, probable mental disturbance. The journal entry, which McLeod kept separately from his official field notes, included a detail he did not put in the report. He wrote that when R left the tent, the temperature was 31 degrees below zero. The canvas flap was open. R had not taken his coat. He had not taken his boots. He had walked into that cold as though it were nothing, as though he could not feel it at all. That journal is held in a private collection in Thunder Bay. It was shown to a researcher from Lakehead University in 1984, who included a brief mention of it in a paper on frontier survey practices. The footnote runs to 3 lines. It does not mention the Wendigo by name, but McLeod did. In the margin of the journal, beside the entry for the night R, sat staring at the tree line, McLeod had written 2 words in a hand less steady than his usual script. He wrote, "The Wendigo." The distance between the hidebehind and the Wendigo is not just geographic. It is a distance of kind. The hidebehind is an external threat. It comes from outside. It stalks. It takes. The person it takes is a victim, and the community that loses them is bereaved. The Wendigo is something else entirely. It comes from inside. It is what the person becomes. The community does not lose a member to the Wendigo. The community watches a member become the Wendigo. The grief is different. The fear is different. It is the fear of looking at someone you know and seeing something you do not, of watching the familiar become foreign, of wondering in the silence of a winter night whether the same seed exists somewhere inside you. Both traditions emerged from forests. Both were carried by men who did hard physical work in extreme isolation. Both provided a framework for understanding disappearances that the official record could not or would not explain. And both persisted long past the point where the rational mind should have discarded them, because the conditions that created them did not change. The forests remained, the cold remained, the silence remained, and men continued to go into the trees and not come back. By the 1930s, when the WPA interviewers were sitting down with retired lumberjacks in Wisconsin nursing homes, the old-growth forests those men had worked were already memory. The great harvest was over. The pines that had taken centuries to grow had been cut in decades, and what remained was cut-over land, stump fields, scrub growth. The men remembered the trees the way you remember a country you lived in as a child, with precision and with loss. Halverson, the man who heard footsteps matching his own in the Oneida County timber, was one of the last men the WPA interviewer spoke to. The transcript notes that the interview took place in a room at a boarding house in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, on a Tuesday afternoon in November 1938. Halverson was seated by a window. His hands were in his lap. He spoke for about 2 hours. At the end of the interview, the transcriber recorded a final exchange. The interviewer asked Halverson if he believed the stories he had told. Halverson was quiet for a while. Then he said he did not think it mattered whether he believed them. He said the woods were gone now, the old woods, the ones that were dark enough and quiet enough and old enough to hold those things. He said what grew back was not the same. It was thin, young. You could see through it. There was no depth to it. Nothing could hide in timber like that. The interviewer asked if that meant the creatures were gone too. Halverson said he did not know. He said maybe they were in the stumps, in the root systems that were still down there, under the new growth under the soil. The old trees had root systems that went down 30, 40 feet and spread out twice as wide as the canopy above. When you cut the tree, the roots did not die right away. They held on for years, sometimes decades, drawing on whatever was left in the soil, maintaining a structure underground that mirrored the forest that had stood above. An invisible architecture, a memory of the woods, persisting beneath the surface long after the visible woods were gone. He said maybe things that lived in a forest that old did not need the trees themselves. Maybe they only needed the roots. The interviewer did not follow up on this. The transcript ends with a note that Halverson thanked the interviewer and asked him to close the window as there was a draft. Halverson died in 1941. He was 86. His obituary in the Rhinelander paper listed his occupation as retired lumberman and mentioned no surviving family. The WPA transcripts were filed in the Oneida County Historical Society archive, where they remained in a cardboard box on a metal shelf for 80 years. The box was labeled Folklore, Lumber Camps, Miscellaneous. It had been opened at least once before I requested it, because someone had placed a sheet of paper on top of the transcripts with a note written in blue ballpoint pen. The note said, "See also, Ashland County Files, 1936. Hide behind, multiple accounts, corroborating. I have not been able to locate the Ashland County Files. The Historical Society there suffered a basement flood in 1997. Much of the collection from that period was damaged or destroyed. The catalog lists the files as missing, presumed lost. The accounts I have shared here exist in that space between the documented and the disappeared. They sit in archives that are underfunded, understaffed, housed in buildings that leak. They survive on acid-free paper in boxes that no one opens. They are not part of any official history. They are not cited in any academic work of significance. They are the words of men who worked with their hands and came home with stories they could not explain and did not try to, men who simply said what they had seen and left it to whoever was listening to make of it what they would. The forests of the upper Midwest are growing back, not the old growth. That's gone beyond recovery on any human timescale. But the second growth and the third growth are filling in. In the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest in northern Wisconsin, in the boundary waters of Minnesota, in the boreal shield country of Ontario, the trees are tall enough now to block the sky. The understory is dark. The canopy is closing. In winter, when the snow absorbs every sound, it is possible to stand in those woods and hear nothing, not quiet, nothing. The kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something else. Something that swallows noise the way deep water swallows light. You can stand in that silence and feel the back of your neck tighten and turn around and see nothing behind you but trees. The root systems of the old pines are still down there. Below the topsoil, below the frost line, in the dark, where nothing changes and nothing decays at the rate it should. A lattice of dead wood and mineral holding the shape of a forest that was cut over a century ago. An architecture with no building above it, a foundation with no house. Halverson's hands were still enormous at 83. The interviewer noted that. He also noted that Halverson, when he was finished speaking, placed those hands flat on the table and held them there for a moment, as though steadying himself, or as though feeling for something through the wood, a vibration, a rhythm, the faintest pulse of something still moving, far below, in the roots of trees that no longer stand. The transcript ends there. The box went back on the shelf. The archive is open by appointment, Tuesday through Thursday, 9 to 4.